The morning started like any other Tuesday for Isabella Rodriguez. She woke up at 5:30 just like she had for the past 3 years, in her small apartment above the bakery on Maple Street. The smell of fresh bread always greeted her, a comforting reminder that some things in life remained constant. She made herself a simple cup of coffee and ate a piece of toast while looking out at the quiet street below. By 6:45, Isabella was already walking through the tall iron gates of the Whitmore estate. The mansion stood like a castle against the morning sky with its white columns and perfectly trimmed gardens. She had grown used to its grandeur, though it still amazed her sometimes how different this world was from her own. Mrs. Catherine Whitmore was already in the kitchen when Isabella arrived, which was unusual. The older woman was pacing back and forth, her silver hair still in curlers, wearing an expensive silk robe that probably cost more than Isabella made in a month. "Oh, Isabella, thank goodness you're here early," Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice filled with stress. "We have a terrible situation." Isabella set down her cleaning supplies and listened carefully. She had learned that when Mrs. Whitmore was upset, it usually meant extra work for everyone in the house. "Tonight's charity gala, for the Children's Hospital," Mrs. Whitmore continued, wringing her hands. 50 of the most important people in the city will be here. The mayor, business leaders, society families, and our pianist just called to cancel. Food poisoning, she says. Isabella nodded politely, not sure why this was being shared with her. She began organizing her cleaning routine in her mind, knowing that preparing for such an event would require extra attention to every detail. "I've called everyone I can think of," Mrs. Whitmore went on. "Every musician, every music teacher, even the high school band director. No one is available on such short notice. This is a disaster." The house was already bustling with activity. The catering staff had arrived early to prepare elaborate dishes. Florists were arranging massive bouquets of white orchids and roses throughout the main rooms. Isabella could hear the sound of furniture being moved in the ballroom as workers set up tables and chairs. As Isabella began her daily routine of dusting and organizing, she couldn't help but notice Mrs. Whitmore's growing panic. Phone calls were made every few minutes, each one ending in disappointment. The woman who usually seemed so composed and in control was clearly falling apart. "Maybe we could just have recorded music," suggested Helen, the head housekeeper who had worked for the family for over 20 years. "Absolutely not," Mrs. Whitmore replied firmly. "These people expect live entertainment, classical music performed properly. They donate thousands of dollars to this cause every year. I can't serve them background music from a speaker." Isabella understood the pressure. She had seen these events before, watched from the kitchen as elegantly dressed guests moved through the house like they owned the world. Everything had to be perfect for them. Every flower had to be in place, every glass had to sparkle, every detail had to meet their high standards. Around noon, while Isabella was cleaning the grand piano in the ballroom, she overheard Mrs. Whitmore on yet another phone call in the adjacent room. "Please, surely you know someone," Mrs. Whitmore was saying desperately. "I'll pay double the usual rate, triple even. This is extremely important." Isabella ran her cloth gently over the piano keys, remembering how long it had been since she had touched a piano properly. This beautiful instrument sat in this room mostly as decoration, played only during special occasions. It was a Steinway Grand, probably worth more than most people's houses. Her fingers lingered on the keys for just a moment. She pressed one gently, so softly that it barely made a sound. The familiar feel of the smooth ivory brought back a flood of memories from what felt like another lifetime. "No luck?" Helen asked Mrs. Whitmore as she hung up the phone. "None at all," Mrs. Whitmore replied, sinking into one of the antique chairs. "I've never been so embarrassed. How do I explain to the mayor's wife that we have no music for a formal gala?" Isabella continued her work silently, but something inside her was stirring. She thought about her grandmother's old upright piano back in Columbia, where she had spent countless hours as a child. She remembered her teacher, Professor Martinez, who had seen something special in her playing. She thought about the conservatory, where she had studied the dreams she had once held so tightly. But those were different times, she reminded herself. That was a different person. Now she was Isabella the housekeeper, Isabella who cleaned and organized and remained invisible to the important people who visited this house. What about local music students? Helen suggested. Maybe someone from the university? I thought of that, Mrs. Whitmore said. But these guests expect professional quality. They know the difference. Some of them are patrons of the symphony orchestra. Isabella finished cleaning the piano and moved on to dusting the bookshelves. But she kept glancing back at the instrument. Her heart was beating faster than usual, and she could feel a familiar stirring in her chest that she hadn't felt in years. As the afternoon wore on, Mrs. Whitmore's stress became more obvious. She snapped at the catering staff over minor details. She rearranged flower arrangements that were already perfect. She changed her mind about the table settings twice. Mrs. Whitmore, Isabella said quietly, approaching her during a brief moment when she was alone in the ballroom. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Yes, Isabella? Please make it quick. I have a million things to handle. Isabella's heart was pounding so hard she was sure Mrs. Whitmore could hear it. I could play the piano tonight. Mrs. Whitmore looked at her as if she had suggested flying to the moon. I'm sorry, what did you say? I can play piano, Isabella repeated, her voice growing slightly stronger. If you need someone for tonight. The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Mrs. Whitmore stared at Isabella with a mixture of surprise and confusion, as if seeing her clearly for the first time in 3 years. You can play piano? Mrs. Whitmore asked slowly. Yes. Ma'am, I learned when I was young. Mrs. Whitmore looked around the room, then back at Isabella. Her desperation was clearly warring with her doubts. These are very sophisticated people, Isabella. They expect professional standards. I understand, Isabella said quietly. Mrs. Whitmore walked over to the piano and gestured toward it. Can you show me something? Just a little bit? Isabella's hands trembled slightly as she sat down at the bench. She positioned her fingers over the keys and began to play a simple Bach piece, something she remembered from her childhood lessons. Even though she was holding back, trying not to reveal too much, the music filled the room with a clarity and warmth that surprised them both. When she finished, Mrs. Whitmore was staring at her with wide eyes. Where did you learn to play like that? In my country before I came here, Isabella answered simply. Mrs. Whitmore looked at her watch, then at Isabella, then back at the piano. The guests would arrive in just 4 hours, and her options had run out completely. All right, she said finally, though her voice carried uncertainty. But Isabella, these people, they have very high expectations, and they can be quite particular about things. Isabella nodded, understanding the warning behind the words. She had seen how these guests looked at her and the other staff members. She knew what she was walking into. Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore. I won't disappoint you. As Isabella left the ballroom to continue her regular duties, she felt something awakening inside her that had been sleeping for far too long. Tonight would change everything, though she couldn't imagine just how much. By 7 o'clock that evening, Isabella had finished all her regular duties and rushed home to prepare for the night ahead. Standing in front of her small closet, she realized she had nothing appropriate for such an elegant event. Her work uniforms hung neatly on one side and her casual clothes on the other. Finally, she pulled out a simple black dress she had bought 2 years ago for her cousin's wedding. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and respectable. She looked at herself in the mirror of her tiny bathroom. Her hands, rough from years of cleaning work, didn't look like the hands of someone who would play for society's elite. She scrubbed them carefully and applied a small amount of hand cream she had been saving. Her hair, usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, she arranged as nicely as she could manage. When Isabella returned to the Whitmore mansion at 8:15, the transformation was remarkable. The entire house glowed with warm light from crystal chandeliers. The smell of expensive perfume and gourmet food filled the air. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved smoothly between guests, carrying silver platters of champagne and delicate appetizers. Isabella entered through the staff entrance, as she always did, but tonight felt different. Helen, the head housekeeper, looked surprised to see her. "What are you doing here so late?" Helen asked. "Mrs. Whitmore asked me to play piano tonight," Isabella explained quietly. Helen's eyebrows shot up. "You? Play for the guests?" Before Isabella could answer, Mrs. Whitmore appeared, looking elegant in a navy blue gown that probably cost more than Isabella made in 6 months. Her earlier panic had been replaced by the composed confidence she always wore during social events. "Isabella, there you are," Mrs. Whitmore said, though she looked slightly uncomfortable. "The guests are arriving. You should start in about 15 minutes. Remember, keep the music soft and classical. Nothing too dramatic." Isabella nodded and made her way toward the ballroom. As she walked through the house, she could hear the sounds of conversation and laughter growing louder. Through doorways, she caught glimpses of women in sparkling gowns and men in perfectly tailored suits. These were people who owned businesses, sat on hospital boards, and made decisions that affected thousands of other people's lives. The ballroom was filled with small groups of guests, all holding champagne glasses and speaking in the confident tones of people accustomed to being heard. Isabella recognized some faces from local newspapers and television. There was the mayor's wife wearing diamonds that caught the light from every angle. Near the windows stood a group of business owners whose companies had their names on buildings. Downtown, Isabella approached the piano, trying to move as invisibly as she always did during her cleaning work. But tonight was different. Tonight, she couldn't remain unseen. "Excuse me," said a woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a dress that shimmered like water. "Are you the pianist for this evening?" Isabella nodded politely. "Yes, ma'am." The woman looked Isabella up and down, taking in her simple dress and her nervous expression. "How interesting," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Then she turned to her companion, a tall man with gray hair and an expensive watch. "Richard, look at this. They've got the help playing music tonight." Richard glanced over and chuckled. Well, Catherine always was creative with her entertaining choices. Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks but tried to focus on arranging her sheet music. She had brought several pieces she knew well, classical works that she hoped would meet Mrs. Whitmore's expectations. As she sat down at the piano bench, more guests began to notice her. The conversations didn't stop, but they became punctuated, with glances in her direction. "Is that really the pianist?" she heard someone whisper. "She looks like she works here," came another voice. A woman in a red dress, loud enough for others to hear, said, "I hope she at least knows more than chopsticks. We're not at a church social after all." The laughter that followed made Isabella's hands tremble slightly as she placed them on the keys. She had performed in front of audiences before, but never like this. Never in front of people who looked at her like she didn't belong, like she was some kind of curiosity rather than a musician. "This should be amusing," said a man standing near the piano. He was younger than most of the other guests, probably in his 30s, wearing a suit that looked like it cost more than Isabella's rent for several months. "I wonder if she takes requests. Maybe some elevator music?" His companions laughed as if he had said something brilliantly funny. Isabella noticed that Mrs. Whitmore was across the room speaking with the mayor and his wife, probably trying to manage the situation and keep her important guests happy. "At least it's free entertainment," added another guest, a woman whose jewelry jingled softly when she moved. "Though I suppose you get what you pay for." Isabella closed her eyes for a moment and thought about her grandmother, who had always told her that music was a gift that belonged to everyone, regardless of who they were or where they came from. She thought about her teacher, Professor Martinez, who had believed in her talent even when her family couldn't afford proper lessons. She opened her eyes and looked down at the piano keys. This was a beautiful instrument, probably tuned to perfection by professionals. It deserved to be played properly, regardless of what these people thought about who was playing it. The conversations around her continued, but now they seemed more pointed, more deliberately cruel. "I heard Catherine was quite desperate," said one woman to her group. "Apparently their real pianist canceled at the last minute." "Well, this is certainly creative problem-solving," replied another, loud enough that Isabella was clearly meant to hear. A man near the champagne table said, I just hope she doesn't try anything too complicated. Some of these people know real music when they hear it. Isabella's heart was beating so fast she could hear it in her ears. Part of her wanted to stand up and walk away, to return to the kitchen where she belonged, where people didn't look at her like she was performing some kind of trick. But another part of her, a part that had been quiet for too long, was beginning to stir. This was the part of her that had once dreamed of concert halls and recording studios, the part that had practiced for hours every day, believing that talent and dedication were enough to overcome any obstacle. She straightened her shoulders and positioned her hands over the keys. The room was still filled with conversation and laughter, most of it at her expense. Glasses clinked, expensive shoes clicked against the marble floor, and the sound of people who had never doubted their place in the world filled every corner of the ballroom. Isabella took a deep breath and prepared to play. She had chosen a piece by Chopin, something beautiful and complex, something that would either prove her worth or confirm their worst assumptions about her. As her fingers touched the keys for the first note, she heard someone nearby say, "Well, let's see what our little housekeeper can do." The laughter that followed was the last sound Isabella heard before her music began to fill the room. What happened next would change everything, though none of these elegant, confident people could have possibly imagined how completely their evening was about to be transformed. Isabella placed her fingers on the piano keys and began with the opening notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. The first few sounds were soft, almost hesitant, like a whispered secret being shared with the room. For a moment, nothing changed. The guests continued their conversations, their laughter, their casual cruelty. But then something magical began to happen. The melody grew stronger, more confident. Isabella's fingers moved across the keys with a grace that seemed impossible. Each note was crystal clear, each phrase shaped with the kind of understanding that only comes from years of dedicated study and natural talent. This wasn't background music. This wasn't simple entertainment for a dinner party. This was art. The first person to stop talking was Dr. Williams, the chief of surgery at the Children's Hospital. He had been in the middle of telling a story about his recent golf game when something in the music caught his attention. He paused mid-sentence, his champagne glass halfway to his lips, and turned toward the piano. The woman in the red dress, who had made the joke about chopsticks just minutes earlier, found herself unable to finish her conversation. The music seemed to wrap around her words and pull them away, leaving only the sound of the piano filling the space where her voice had been. Isabella's hands moved with impossible precision. The difficult passages that would challenge even professional pianists flowed from her fingers like water. She wasn't just playing the notes on the page. She was telling a story, painting pictures with sound, creating emotions that reached into the hearts of everyone in the room. One by one, conversations began to die away. The laughter stopped. The casual chatter that had filled the ballroom just moments before was replaced by something much more powerful, complete and total attention. Mrs. Whitmore, who had been nervously watching from across the room, felt her mouth fall open. She had heard Isabella play that simple Bach piece earlier in the day, but this was something entirely different. This was the kind of performance she had only experienced at the City Symphony Hall, with world-renowned musicians who had studied at the finest conservatories. The young businessman who had joked about elevator music found himself moving closer to the piano, drawn by something he couldn't quite understand. He had attended dozens of these charity events, had heard plenty of professional musicians perform, but there was something about Isabella's playing that was different. It wasn't just technically perfect, though it clearly was. It was deeply emotional, as if she was pouring her entire soul into every note. The music built and swirled, carrying everyone in the room on a journey they hadn't expected to take. The piece moved from gentle melancholy to passionate intensity, from whispered secrets to bold declarations. Isabella's face had changed completely. Gone was the nervous, apologetic expression she had worn while enduring their cruel comments. In its place was the focused, confident look of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and why she was doing it. Mrs. Patterson, the mayor's wife, found tears forming in her eyes. She couldn't remember the last time music had affected her so deeply. She had grown up taking piano lessons, had even considered studying music seriously before choosing a more practical path. But she had never played like this. She had never even heard anyone play like this outside of concert halls and recording studios. The businessman named Robert, who owned half the real estate downtown, stopped his conversation with the city council member completely. He had been talking about property values and development plans, but those concerns seemed suddenly small and unimportant compared to the beauty filling the room. His wife, standing beside him, reached for his hand without thinking, both of them united in their amazement at what they were witnessing. Isabella's performance continued, each section of the complex piece revealing new layers of skill and artistry. Her fingers danced across the keys with a confidence that spoke of years of training and practice. This wasn't someone who had taken a few piano lessons as a child. This was someone who understood music at the deepest level, someone who could take the composer's written notes and transform them into something alive and breathing. The woman with the blonde hair who had first noticed Isabella's presence was now standing completely still, her earlier dismissive attitude replaced by genuine shock. She prided herself on her cultural knowledge, had season tickets to the opera, and considered herself quite sophisticated when it came to the arts. But she had never expected to hear this level of artistry from someone she had dismissed as the help just minutes before. Even the catering staff had stopped their work. Waiters stood frozen with their silver platters, forgetting about the appetizers they were supposed to be serving. The bartender had paused in the middle of mixing a drink, his attention completely captured by the music flowing from the piano. Isabella was lost in the music now, completely absorbed in the performance. Her earlier nervousness had melted away, replaced by the confidence that came from doing something she truly loved and truly excelled at. This was who she really was, beneath the uniform and the quiet demeanor and the years of cleaning other people's houses. This was the artist she had always been, even when life had forced her to hide that part of herself. The music reached its most challenging section, a passage that required incredible technical skill and emotional maturity. Isabella's hands flew across the keys, playing runs and arpeggios that would be difficult for any pianist while never losing the musical line or the emotional impact of the piece. She wasn't just showing off her technique, though her technique was clearly extraordinary. She was using every bit of her skill to serve the music, to bring out its beauty and power. Mrs. Whitmore felt a strange mixture of emotions washing over her. She was amazed by Isabella's talent, of course, but she was also embarrassed by her own assumptions. For 3 years, this remarkable musician had been working in her house, quietly doing her job, while harboring this incredible gift. How many times had Mrs. Whitmore walked past Isabella without really seeing her, without imagining that she might have dreams and talents and a whole other life beyond her work? The piece built toward its climax, the music becoming more intense and passionate with each measure. Isabella's entire body was involved in the performance now, swaying slightly with the rhythm, her face reflecting the emotions in the music. She was no longer the invisible housekeeper who cleaned the piano bench every morning. She was a true artist, sharing her gift with a room full of people who were finally ready to see her for who she really was. As the music reached its peak, not a single person in the ballroom was talking. Not one glass clinked, not one shoe clicked against the marble floor. 50 of the city's most important people stood in complete silence, transfixed by the performance of someone they had dismissed and ridiculed just minutes before. The transformation was complete, though the music wasn't finished yet. Isabella continued playing, unaware of the stunned faces around her, focused only on bringing Chopin's beautiful and complex composition to life in a way that honored both the composer and her own incredible abilities. In that moment, everything had changed, though none of them fully understood yet just how profound that change would be. When the last note of the Chopin piece faded into silence, the ballroom remained perfectly quiet for what felt like an eternity. Isabella sat at the piano bench, her hands still resting on the keys, breathing deeply as she returned from the musical world she had just inhabited. Slowly, she became aware of the silence around her and looked up to see 50 pairs of eyes staring at her in complete amazement. Then the applause began. It started with Dr. Williams, who began clapping slowly, his face showing genuine awe. Within seconds, the entire room erupted in applause that was unlike anything Isabella had ever experienced. This wasn't polite social clapping. This was the kind of enthusiastic appreciation usually reserved for world-class performers at prestigious concert halls. Mrs. Whitmore was the first to approach the piano. Her eyes bright with tears she was trying hard not to shed in front of her guests. "Isabella," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. That was absolutely incredible. I had no idea. In 3 years, I never knew you could." Isabella smiled modestly, still feeling the adrenaline from her performance. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore. But where did you learn to play like that?" Mrs. Whitmore asked, her curiosity overcoming her usual social composure. That level of skill doesn't come from casual lessons. The other guests had begun to gather around the piano now, their earlier dismissive attitudes completely forgotten. They looked at Isabella with new eyes, seeing her not as the quiet housekeeper who dusted their gathering spaces, but as the remarkable artist she had just proven herself to be. Isabella looked around at all the faces watching her expectantly. For so many years she had kept her past locked away, too painful to discuss, too different from her current reality to seem relevant. But something about tonight, about the way the music had felt flowing through her fingers again, made her want to share her story. "I studied music in Colombia," she began quietly, "at the National University in Bogota. I was working toward my master's degree in piano performance." The guests listened intently, hanging on every word. Mrs. Patterson, the mayor's wife, stepped closer. "You were studying to be a professional pianist?" "Yes," Isabella nodded. "I had been playing since I was 5 years old. My grandmother had an old upright piano that she bought from a church when they got a new one. It was out of tune most of the time, but I loved it. She taught me my first songs, little folk melodies from her childhood." She paused, remembering those early days when music had seemed like the most natural thing in the world. "When I was 8, a music teacher heard me playing at a school concert and convinced my parents to let me take proper lessons. We couldn't really afford it, but my mother cleaned houses for extra money to pay for my lessons." The irony of that statement wasn't lost on anyone in the room, especially Mrs. Whitmore, who suddenly understood the full circle of Isabella's journey. "I was 17 when I auditioned for the university," Isabella continued. "I played a Rachmaninoff concerto for the entrance exam. Professor Martinez, the head of the piano department, said I had natural talent but needed to work twice as hard as everyone else to develop it properly." Robert, the businessman who had earlier joked about elevator music, found himself genuinely interested in her story. "So you were studying to become a concert pianist?" "That was the dream," Isabella said with a wistful smile. "I practiced 6 hours a day, sometimes more. I won a few competitions, played with the student orchestra. Professor Martinez thought I might be able to study abroad someday, maybe in Europe or here in the United States." "What happened?" asked the woman in the red dress, her voice now filled with genuine concern rather than the mockery it had carried earlier. Isabella's expression grew more serious. "The violence in Colombia got worse. My father had a small business, a little grocery store in our neighborhood. Some people didn't like that he wouldn't pay protection money to the gangs. One night they came to our house. The room grew even quieter, if that was possible. These were people who lived in a world of safety and privilege, where the biggest worry was usually which charity event to attend or which vacation destination to choose. They told us we had 1 week to leave the city, or they would hurt my family," Isabella continued. "My parents made the decision to leave Colombia completely. They had saved some money, enough for us to come to the United States, but we had to leave everything behind. My grandmother's piano, my music books, my dreams of graduating from the university." Mrs. Whitmore felt a knot forming in her stomach as she realized how little she had known about the woman who had been working in her house for 3 years. "I was 22 when we arrived here," Isabella said. "My English wasn't very good, and my music degree from Columbia didn't mean much to employers here. To get the same credentials, I would need to start over, take classes, pass exams, but we needed money immediately to survive. Dr. Williams, who had immigrated to the United States himself many years earlier, nodded with understanding. Starting over in a new country is never easy. My mother got sick soon after we arrived, Isabella continued. The stress of leaving everything behind, the worry about our future, it affected her health. I needed to work to pay for her medical care and to send money back to my grandmother, who was too old to leave Colombia. The guests were completely absorbed in her story now. These were people accustomed to having their problems solved with money or connections, but they were beginning to understand the kind of challenges that couldn't be fixed so easily. I took whatever jobs I could find, Isabella said. I worked in restaurants, cleaned offices at night, took care of elderly people. Every job was just about surviving, about making sure my family was okay. Music became something from my past, something I couldn't afford to think about. But you never lost your ability, observed Mrs. Patterson. Tonight proved that. Isabella smiled sadly. I tried not to play for a long time. It hurt too much to remember what I had lost. But sometimes late at night in my apartment I would practice on a little keyboard I bought at a thrift store. It wasn't the same as a real piano, but it helped me remember who I used to be. The young businessman who had made the elevator music, Joke, looked ashamed as he realized how carelessly he had dismissed someone with such a remarkable background and talent. When Mrs. Whitmore asked me to play tonight, I was terrified, Isabella admitted. I hadn't played a real piano in front of people for almost 8 years. I wasn't sure I could still do it. But you could, said Mrs. Whitmore, her voice filled with wonder. You played like someone who had been performing professionally all her life. Isabella looked down at her hands, still hardly believing what had just happened. Music is something that never really leaves you, I think. It becomes part of who you are. Even when life takes you in different directions, it's still there, waiting. The guests stood in thoughtful silence, processing everything they had learned. In the span of one evening, their understanding of Isabella had been completely transformed. She wasn't just the quiet housekeeper anymore. She was a talented artist whose dreams had been interrupted by circumstances beyond her control, but whose gift had never truly disappeared. What none of them could have predicted was how this revelation would change not just how they saw Isabella, but how they saw themselves in their own responsibilities to the people around them. After hearing Isabella's story, the atmosphere in the ballroom had completely changed. The same people who had mocked her an hour earlier now looked at her with respect and genuine interest. But Isabella wasn't finished yet. Something had awakened inside her during that first performance, and she felt compelled to continue. Would you like to hear something else? She asked softly, looking around at the expectant faces. Please, said Mrs. Whitmore immediately. If you're willing. Isabella turned back to the piano and began the opening of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, playing both the orchestra and piano parts as much as possible on the single instrument. The piece was incredibly demanding, requiring not just technical skill but deep emotional understanding. As her fingers moved across the keys, the ballroom filled with music that seemed to capture every feeling a human heart could hold. The guests were mesmerized once again, but this time, they were listening with different ears. They weren't just hearing beautiful music anymore. They were hearing the story of someone who had overcome incredible challenges, someone who had kept her dreams alive, even when life had taken everything else away from her. When she finished, the Rachmaninoff spontaneous applause filled the room again. But this time people didn't just clap and walk away. They stayed, wanting to know more, wanting to understand how they could help. Dr. Williams was the first to speak. Isabella, that was extraordinary. Have you thought about returning to professional music? Isabella looked uncertain. I would love to, but it's complicated. I would need to get certified here, take exams, build credentials that employers would recognize. And I still need to work to support my family. What if there was a way to do both? Asked Robert, the businessman who had earlier made cruel jokes. His entire demeanor had changed, and he seemed genuinely committed to making amends for his earlier behavior. I know people in the music industry. There might be opportunities we could explore. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward. My husband sits on the board of the city's symphony orchestra. I could arrange for you to meet with the music director. They're always looking for talented musicians, especially for their community outreach programs. Isabella felt overwhelmed by the sudden flood of offers and suggestions. For so many years she had felt invisible, forgotten by a world that had once valued her talent. Now, in one evening, that world seemed to be opening up to her again. "There's something else I'd like you to hear," Isabella said, her voice growing stronger with confidence. "Something from my grandmother, from my home." She began to play a traditional Colombian folk song, something her grandmother had taught her as a child. But Isabella didn't play it simply. She took the basic melody and transformed it, adding harmonies and variations that showed both her classical training and her deep connection to her cultural roots. The music told the story of her homeland, of mountains and rivers, of families, gathering in small houses filled with love and music. As she played, tears began to form in the eyes of several guests. The music was so deeply personal, so full of longing and love and loss that it reached into something universal in all of them. They began to understand that Isabella wasn't just a talented pianist. She was an artist who could use music to build bridges between different worlds, different experiences, different hearts. When the Colombian piece ended, the silence in the room felt sacred. Finally, a woman near the back of the group began to clap slowly, and soon everyone joined in. But this applause was different from before. It was quieter, more thoughtful, filled with genuine appreciation for what they had just experienced. "That was incredible," whispered Mrs. Whitmore. "I've never heard anything like it." Over the next hour, something remarkable happened. Instead of returning to their separate conversations about business deals and social events, the guests stayed gathered around the piano. They asked Isabella questions about her music, her background, her dreams for the future. More importantly, they began to offer real, concrete help. Dr. Williams offered to connect her with a music therapy program at the hospital. "We've been looking for someone to work with our young patients. Music can be incredibly healing for children going through difficult treatments." Robert pulled out his business card. "I own several properties downtown, including a small concert hall that's been sitting empty. Maybe we could work out an arrangement for you to use it for practice, or even for small performances." Mrs. Patterson was already making plans. "I'm going to call the symphony director tomorrow morning, and I know several music teachers who give private lessons to wealthy families. They're always looking for qualified substitutes." A woman who owned an art gallery suggested organizing a benefit concert. "We could sell tickets and donate the proceeds to a scholarship fund for immigrant musicians. I think people would be very interested in hearing you perform." Isabella listened to all these offers with growing amazement. She had spent so many years feeling like her dreams were impossible, like the gap between her current life and her musical aspirations was too wide to cross. Now, in one evening, people were building bridges for her. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Mrs. Whitmore pulled her aside privately. "Isabella, I owe you an apology," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For 3 years you've been working in my home and I never really saw you. I never asked about your life, your dreams, your talents. I'm ashamed of that." Isabella shook her head. "Mrs. Whitmore, you don't need to apologize. You gave me a job when I needed one. You've always been kind to me." "But I could have been so much more than just kind," Mrs. Whitmore replied. "From now on, things are going to be different. I want you to use the piano here whenever you want to practice. And I'm going to help you get back to the music world where you belong." As the evening wound down, Isabella found herself surrounded by business cards, phone numbers, and promises of help. The guests who had arrived thinking they were just attending another charity dinner were leaving with their perspectives completely changed. Robert approached her one more time before leaving. "I want to apologize for the things I said earlier. I was wrong, and I'm embarrassed by my behavior. But I want you to know that I'm going to do everything I can to help make up for it." Isabella smiled at him. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after we realize we've made them." As the last guests departed, Isabella sat alone at the piano for a few more minutes. She played softly, a gentle melody that seemed to capture all the emotions of the evening. Hope, gratitude, excitement, and just a touch of disbelief that her life could change so dramatically in just one night. Mrs. Whitmore found her there a few minutes later. "How are you feeling?" she asked. Isabella looked up with tears in her eyes, but they were happy tears. "Like I've been sleeping for 8 years and I'm finally waking up." 3 months later, Isabella gave her first official concert in Robert's downtown venue. The small hall was packed with many of the same people who had first heard her play in the Whitmore Ballroom. But now they weren't just wealthy guests at a charity event. They were her supporters, her friends, and her believers. The concert was a huge success, and it was just the beginning. Isabella's story had reminded everyone present that extraordinary gifts could be found in the most unexpected places, and that taking the time to truly see and appreciate the people around us could change lives in ways we never imagined.